People, if you go over your time, people will feel robbed. So like if like you say, I'm going to finish at 12, or if you're given 9 to 12 and you go to 12:05, nobody's going to pay attention. Everybody's just going to be zoned out. Like very, very few people that will continue to pay attention, because the Westerners are like taught that their time is precious and it's their time, and if you take away their time, they feel robbed. And so I'm sure anybody who's grown up in the West can attest to the fact that like if someone goes over time, you're just like, okay, I'm ready to leave, like I'm done, this is out, like you shut off. But a lot of Eastern thinking is like if you go over time, they're like grateful for it. So if you go over a little bit, they feel like they're getting more. At least that's how it is in Taiwan. So like if you go over time a little bit in the East, they often are thankful because they receive more. So it depends on where you teach. So like
that all the time.
Yeah, not everywhere. Yeah. So in the West, because that's generally how it is in the West, you try to accommodate that. And so in the West, I try to finish on it like exactly when I say I will. And if I am expecting not to, I tell the audience so that they know, okay, we're going to go till 12:15, and then if I let you out before 12:15, all of you are going to feel relieved. I guarantee it. Like you're like, oh, that's so great. Like so, if I tell you like we're going to go till 12:10, we're going to go to 12:10, and I let you out at 12 because I know I'm going to let you out at 12, you're all going to be like 10 minutes early. This is awesome. You're like, yes. And so like that's honestly like that's just the way it is. And so, and then the East, you just like generally would go, so you could be like, oh, we're going to finish at 11:45 today, and then you go till 12, knowing you're going to go till 12, and everybody's like, this is great. So, generally, I mean, that obviously that doesn't apply to everybody, but generally, that's how it is, Eastern Western culture.
So, we need to steal, we're thieves. We need to
Okay, guys. I'm not teaching you to be sinners. All right, number 5. So number 5, this is going to be your first step in like preparing your lecture. Okay. So all the other things are kind of preemptive. So everything else comes before you prepare your lecture. So you're going to pray, you're going to consider your audience. What was number 3? Choose your topic. Number 4, study. So these all come before you start really preparing your lecture. So number 5 is where you start preparing your lecture. And number 5 is set goals and objectives. So before you start preparing a lecture, you need to set goals and objectives. And regardless of your audience, you need goals. Okay, so if I'm, like I've talked about before, if I'm teaching 5-year-olds at a Sunday school, I need a goal. If I'm teaching a class at a Bible college, I need a goal. That's what a syllabus is for colleges. That's the goals of the course. So we need to have goals in our teaching. And it can't just be a random slew of information. So you need to know the direction you're going, you need to know what you're wanting to achieve, and what you're wanting people to learn. Because you're there to cause people to learn. So you need to know what you're causing them to learn, or what you're wanting them to walk away with. You want to think about what you want people to say they learned. Excuse me. Okay? So if you ask somebody at the end of your teaching, what did you learn? That should be what you want to teach them. So what you're going to teach them is what you want them to learn, right? So if you ask them, what did you learn? And they're like, yeah, I learned about this, this, and this. And you're like, well, it's not really what I was teaching. Then that actually probably was what you were teaching, but you didn't have the right goals set. So you need to think about what you are going to teach, and you want to think about what you want people to walk away with, what they are saying they will learn. So if you can't sum up your teaching in one sentence, neither will your listeners be able to. There's a great saying that I used to not agree with, but I think the more I've thought about it, the more I've started to agree with it. And it is, if you can't say it in 5 minutes, you shouldn't say it in an hour. And so basically your message should be able to be summed up very shortly and very quickly. Think of Jesus' messages and his sayings. The message usually culminates in a single saying. And he might expound upon something, but then he'll come back to one sole thing. So like Luke chapter 14, the culminating saying is, unless you lay down your life, you can't be my disciple. Unless you take up your cross, you can't be my disciple. But the 5 or 7 verses before that all explain what it means to lay your life down. So what we want to be able to do is to set goals so that we know what people are going to learn and that they can sum it up well. So we can set general goals for the whole and then some specific goals for each hour. So for myself, I used to write these out a lot. So when I first started, I wrote them out. And if you guys are teaching, you should write them out when you first start teaching, okay? So you should always write them down because you will then be able to better communicate them. But the more I have taught, the more I just think about, okay, this is what I want people to learn. So I've gone from writing it down all the time to just doing it in my mind, just because that's how my personality works. But don't take that as the go-to, okay? Think about yourself, how you work. Is it better for you to write down? Because for me, I write my notes by hand because then I will remember them better. I process them. Because the more senses you involve in preparing something or retaining something, the longer you will retain it. That's why taking notes by hand, you retain much more than if you take them on the computer. Because you have to process things differently. You have to engage different parts of your brain for it. So doing things like that helps me to retain it. So like my teachings, I just retain so much of it because of the fact that I did it by hand. And so when you write your goals by hand, you'll communicate them better and understand them better. So how to write a goal? You want to start with an action word, okay? So this is just a simple way. You can write your goals however you want, but this is a really easy way. So you're going to start with an action word, and then you are going to include your audience. And then you're going to finish it up with what you plan to communicate. So, for example, a goal that I would write for you guys right now is to prepare the teaching seminar students to prepare a lecture, or to cause the teaching seminar students to learn how to prepare a lecture. Okay, so it becomes something simple like that. Or you can talk about like teaching history. So action word: impart to the DBS the love for the Word of God, or love for New Testament history. So your goals can be written out like that, but it's going to be, this is the easiest way to write them out, okay, is to have an action word. What is the action that you are wanting to do? You're wanting to cause somebody to learn. You're wanting them to retain information. You're going to want them to have imparted to them. And so it's going to start with an action word. And then your audience. Who are you doing it to? And then what are you wanting to communicate to them? What are you wanting them to retain? So, this can take time and be frustrating from time to time, because you're just like, okay, what am I really trying to do? And how am I supposed to condense it down this small? And what kind of action word am I really trying to use in this situation or do with these people? And it can be difficult at first, and honestly for me it was difficult at first to do goals, set goals. But the more time you put into it, the more practice you put into it, the easier it will become. So, if you don't know your goals, neither will your audience. Okay? If you don't know where you're going or what you're doing, then they won't know either. we got to remember, if we can't sum it up, neither will they be able to. So we need to know what we're trying to say, and we need to be able to sum it up. So, number 6 is mind mapping. How? Yes?
Do you like to do this when you're giving a teaching up front for some of the lectures? This is what we're going to cover in the next hour or overall?
Yes.
Do
So,
you like so that they can track with you, or do you do it just at the end?
I do both. So, when I talk about, we'll talk about structuring of lecture in just a moment. No, it's okay. It's great. Because your questions are, these are the questions you should be asking because that's where we're going. So, something I will talk about is like previewing and then reviewing. And so, because you guys don't know, or I haven't given you yet the structure that I follow for lectures and that most people will follow to be effective in their teaching, you haven't known what to look for in my teaching. But if you had known, you would have paid attention to the fact that I did overview what I was going to teach. And I did say, like, this is what we're going to, this is where we're going. And so I gave like a brief map for like where we're going. And then when I review, I go over everything I did. So we will talk about that in a moment. But the next bit after setting your goals is mind mapping. And mind mapping can take the many different forms. So here is one mind map. And what you start with in the center is your topic. Okay, so the topic, like let's say, if you're going to teach a book of the Bible, in the top center would be James. Okay, and so I taught the book of James in DBS topically, right? We talked about the rich and the poor, we talked about the tongue, talked about wisdom, and the other two. And so what I would do is I would branch off 5 different arms, and those would be my topics. And then I would say, okay, what do I want to hit on each of these topics? And I would expand more. And so this is one way to do it. So for creative people who usually have more of a creative mind to let things just flow, this is usually the easiest way to do it. Okay, so for example, people like Joshua might find it easier to do a mind map than I would. This is like hell for me. You know, I have such a hard time doing stuff like this. It is like pulling teeth. Like I will get so little done doing a mind map. But mind mapping doesn't have to be like this, okay? So, like I said before, think about yourself. Think about how you function. Because I don't want to create a bunch of Christers to teach, okay? I want to have you guys be unique in your teaching and in your preparation for teaching. So, in mind mapping, you don't want to be boxed in, but this is a great way to brainstorm, all right? So starting with the topic in the center and then going out. Now, someone who loves this is Amy Stevens, the woman who created the Titus Project teachings and seminar. She loves this. It works great for some people and not great for other people. But what I would suggest is trying it if you've never tried it before. So I had to try it to find out I hated it. But when I tried it, I found out I like a different way better. Okay, so I do this for myself. So this is one way of doing it, and I highly recommend trying this way. And you might find you love this, right? And the topic of this is just called mind mapping, but really you could call it brainstorming. Okay, and what I do is for me, like I've said before, I do a lot of it in my head. So I think about the things I want to talk about and where I'm going to go and what I'm going to do with all of my teaching. But what I did at the beginning and what I still do sometimes is write it down on paper. And what I'll do is, because I think linearly and progressively, I'll just write down the topics and write down the things that are coming to my mind just in succession. So my mind, for example, women find this much easier than men. Because women's minds process things differently than men's do, right? So, for example, I think a lot of the women could relate in here. I am just using an illustration. I'm not making any value statements, okay? A woman's mind is similar to a plate of spaghetti. And the idea is that you pick up one end and then you connect it and they just start connecting. And so I say something like puppies and you're like, oh, this, and then that leads to this, and this, and this, and it just connects all over the place. And that's why this is great, because you start with one topic, and then it jumps over here, and then back to the other side, and all over the place like this. Whereas a man's mind is more like a file cabinet, where you bring up one topic, and then the drawer is going to open, and you're only in there. But if it was like a woman's mind, it'd be like a file cabinet full of spaghetti, where like you pull open one thing, and there's just like noodles connected to the other drawers, and it's just all interconnected. So that's why, for me, like writing stuff out just comes like that, because the ideas connect one to the other, whereas like this, all the ideas will connect with each other pretty much. And so don't feel like you have to teach the same as other people. Women teach way different from men because of the way their minds operate usually. Okay? So don't feel like you have to be boxed in to do it one single way. Right?
Do you find a difference between the way men and women teach?
By listening to them.
No, I mean, not how do you find, but what have you found to be that differences? How are they different?
I think men find it very, very easy to teach progressively and linearly. So where you have like one point and then a bunch of subpoints to that, and then you completely switch topics to something else. Where I find that women are really good at connecting everything together. And so it'll be like super connected all the way through. Whereas like, for me, I have to work a lot on that. So it is more of this like cyclical style teaching without intentionally being cyclical. Okay, so the Western style, or for me, what I find more common in men is just to teach like this. And this is more common in the West, right? So you have A, and then you have 1, and then you have B, or then you have A again, and B, and then C. Whereas I find it more common in the East teaches in a cyclical pattern. And this is your topic right here. But your topic connects like this. And then you will teach around the topic back to another point. And then you'll teach around that back to another point. But all of these points tie back into your central point. And I find this much more common in Eastern teaching. It's cyclical, or one way of calling it is like the petals on a flower. So women might more commonly teach, and this is more common in the East too, is like this. This is your topic, and all of your points will go out and come back, and go out and come back, and go out and come back. But every single one of them is connected with a central topic. Elliot.
What would that look like?
Yeah, Gospel of John is very much like this, cyclical. Gospel of John is very, very cyclical. He uses a bunch of different stories to prove the same point. A person who teaches like this every single time they teach is Lauren Cunningham. And a lot of us have a very hard time listening to Lauren and think, where the heck is he going with all these stories? But the more you listen, so when I first came to YWAM in 2009, I had such a hard time listening to Lauren. Like, it was so difficult. But the more that I've listened to him, the easier it has become to listen to him. And the more I've spent time listening to this, I find he'll tell a story, and then I'll be like, okay, I have to consciously think, how does this story connect with the last story? And when I've started to think about that, I see so much connection and interconnection with the cyclical style of stories. And he might tell a story that you're like, that is so different from the last story you told. But his point isn't how different they are, but what is the same. And that's a lot of how he teaches, and it's very cyclical. And he's coming back to the same points, and it's your job to find what is the main point he's teaching. Yes?
So as we do the audience thing.
Think about your audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're not used to this cyclical teaching,
Yeah.
you can't really do it.
So this is something that it's going to be more common for you to teach a certain way. And even if your audience learns in a certain way, you can still teach them in a way that you're comfortable with, but considering their needs. So because of schools, okay, so you know the modern school, the way we do modern education was created out of the Western culture. I mean, it's been adopted pretty much all over the world. And so because of that, a lot of schools teach the same way all over the world, very linearly and progressively. And so this style of learning has become more common and is easier to teach to anybody because of that. So this is much more common in storytelling cultures. So like this would be really common in Ecuador, if you guys are still going to Ecuador, or places like India or tribal cultures. This is really common. So yeah. So we want to think about our like mind mapping and being creative. So all that to be said, think about what works for you and do that. And try other ways. Don't be boxed into just saying, okay, well this is the only one that works for me and that's all I'm going to do. When I was in Titus Project, I practiced with other brainstorming ways because I was like, okay, maybe this one will work for me. Maybe I'll try it and it'll be fun. And I just tried a bunch of different ways and then figured out which one was the best. So be creative, try a bunch of different ways, and take your time. And I think I'm talking a little bit about this on Tuesday, learning styles. We'll be about like communication styles a little bit. So do not be boxed in on your mind mapping or brainstorming, but that'll come like you're just laying out ideas for where you want to go and how you want to teach and the things you want to teach. So you take your resource material, you set goals, and then you map it out, kind of brainstorm it a little bit. And then number 7, determining your lecture sessions. So as you determine your lecture sessions, you're going to have, depending on the amount of time that you have, will determine how you plan out your lecture sessions. Okay? So for me, if I only have 1 hour, then I just have 1 hour to plan out for a lecture. And that's all I have to worry about. But for something like this, I have to think about, okay, I'm going to be doing 3 hours a day, and I'm probably going to be doing an hour and a half or an hour and 20 minutes or so per session. And I have to think, okay, what am I going to do for this session, what are the topics, what are the goals, and everything like that. So you want to think about what are the sessions I have. Now if you're only teaching one time, then that's the only session you have. But if you're teaching in a DTS, for example, or you're going to go back home and do a Bible study, or you're going to do a Bible study with your church, and it's going to be a 12-week Bible study, you have 12 sessions to think about, not just 1 week. And then comes the next week and you think about the next week. But if you're doing 12 weeks, you want to think about all 12 weeks at once. What am I going to do for each of these weeks? How am I going to progress? Where am I going to? What is my ultimate goal? Or what is my goal for each of the weeks? How am I going to tie them together and connect them? And so you want to think about your lecture sessions, the time that is given to you, and is it going to be extensive? Okay, so is it going to be a lot of time or a little bit of time? And then you want to map your material over the given time. And so you'll understand, okay, after you teach a little bit, you would come to understand that doing a mind map of this size and this amount of information, you could teach on this for about an hour and a half. I mean, that's totally hypothetical. I'm not saying you could teach this one for an hour and a half, but maybe you find out, like, okay, if I do this much work, I could use this for an hour and a half of teaching. So for example, I know that when I write 3 pages in this notebook, that it will take me about 45 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes to cover, depending on how extensively or how condensed I've done it. And I can take 1, or I can take 2 sheets and do that in a whole hour. So I know how much I can write out. And so you'll come to know, okay, how much do I need to write out for the coverage? And so when you're writing out a lecture, when you first start, you guys, you want to write it out extensively, okay? You want to write things out more completely. And then as you become more experienced teachers, you'll want to summarize a little bit as you go. So learning how to summarize things and condense things so that you have something here and that sparks something in your mind and you start talking about it. So what I do now is I only write down my main points mostly, and then I'll let those spark other things as I write, or as I'm speaking. And so determining your lecture sessions, you want to think about your time frame and your breaks. So what's the amount of time you have? What are the length of the breaks you're going to take? How often are you going to take breaks? In YWAM Kona, we do breaks once during a 3-hour session at the hour and a half mark usually. But you go to someplace like India and they take a break like 3 times in the morning. And that's just different. In Taiwan, we did them every 45 minutes. So you're just thinking about how you want to do it. And don't feel like you have to be boxed in. So you can do your breaks differently. Determining your lecture sessions, you want to think about illustrations, your content, how deep you want to go with your content, and then think about the difficult texts you're teaching. So if you're teaching a book, you want to think, okay, what are the difficult passages? How much time am I going to spend on them? Am I really going to emphasize them? Because those are a huge part of teaching, is the difficult passages. In this point, number 7, determining your lecture sessions. You want to aim for 45-minute sessions if you're teaching extensive time or little time. Because the average attention span of adults to pay attention before they're going to start losing it is around 45 minutes. So the most amount of information they can take in, and then if they have a break every 45 minutes, they're going to stay fresh the whole morning. So that's just going to be how it is. So for Kona, we break at an hour and a half, which honestly isn't that great. And something you might have noticed is Dan Lewis took 2 breaks, and he did it every 45 minutes. So he did it because he knew people would stay more fresh. And so 45 minutes is the best way to do it. So this morning we have taken a few breaks so that you guys are up and moving and active and staying more fresh. Right? So that's how we've done it, and that's what is the best way to engage people's minds. In the back of the booklet, that's the Basics of Bible Teaching, the BBT booklet on the flash drive in the folder, at the end of it is a prep sheet that has a lecture sessions, and you can lay out what topics you want to cover, how long you have to cover them, when you want to do breaks, that kind of stuff. That's really good for extensive periods of time, or even extended periods over a number of weeks. So that sheet is really helpful for budgeting your time. And when you have multiple sessions, what you guys will want to do is goal set for each session. Okay, so it's not, goal setting isn't something you just want to do once and then you're done. Okay, you want to think about each session. What am I wanting somebody to learn in this session? How is it different from the other sessions? You can do a whole day the same goals, but you just want to think about the goals for what you're teaching so that you know that it's going to be effectively communicated. Because if you don't know your goals, then neither will your students. All right, so after you've determined your lecture sessions, you're going to structure your lecture. And so structuring a lecture like this, the structuring of your lecture is like building the house. Okay, you're putting up the beams, you're putting up the walls, but everything is still a skeleton. Okay? So as you structure your lecture, you're like building a house. And to have a great lecture, it must be well organized. Okay? So structure is very, very important. And for people who might not be the most structured in your day or organized in your day, this can potentially be more difficult. Okay? So if you are someone who is just like, in the Myers-Briggs language, if you're really a perceiver, a P, and you don't plan your schedule out, you don't think about what you're going to do that day, then this can be more difficult. But structuring your lecture is really important so you know where you're going, when you're going there, how you're getting there. So this is really, really important for all of the listeners. So in the back of the Bible teaching handout, the booklet, there is a sheet called a teaching synopsis. And because the Bible teaching booklet is a booklet, it's a PDF, I included also the basic Bible teaching Word document, I think, or it's a PDF by itself, and it's also in Chinese. So, yeah, so it's Chinese on there as well for you guys. And that lays out for you a lot of things to consider. So it talks about your audience, what's your topic, all that kind of stuff on there. So it's really helpful for laying out your lecture. It's how I lay out all of my lectures. Okay? So I'm going to give you the basics for what this is on this teaching synopsis sheet. So, how to structure your lecture. Each lecture is going to need an opening. And you're going to open your lecture always with something, and sharing something. Every lecture needs an opening. So often what I'll do, for example, the first lecture that I ever come in to teach people, I'll come in and say, hey, I'm so excited to be with you guys. I've been praying for you guys. I've been thinking about this lecture a lot, and that kind of stuff. And I usually spend about 2 or 3 minutes talking about leading up to this lecture. And that's how I open my lecture. And then, if I'm doing a follow-up lecture, my opening for the lecture will be review, right? So, for example, tomorrow morning, I'll probably open by reviewing everything we learned today, and that will be my opening. Now, the next step is the hardest for me, and this is create the need. So the second thing you do after you open a lecture is you're going to create a need. Why do people need to listen to you? What do you really have to teach them? What is going to hook them in? So for like fishing, this is the hook. You want to hook people so that you have them the entire lecture. So you want to hook them by bringing them in here. And the ways you do this to get people hooked in is you can read a quote to them. You can tell them a story. You can read a statistic or ask a question, something that startles them or sparks their curiosity. Something that's really going to grab your listeners. Now for me, this was the hardest part in learning how to prepare a lecture. I could write a lecture, I could lay out the body, the main points, think of illustrations, all that came really easy. But getting people to listen is super hard for me. Like, at the beginning, it was really difficult. And the reason is because I was just thinking, well, in teaching the Bible, people should already be interested. Like, should grab people enough, it's the Bible. But I had to think about, okay, well, people actually need something to draw them in. So, for example, this morning, I might not have gotten everybody on this, but how I created the need this morning is by sparking the idea of us being nervous in preparing. How do we prepare? What does it look like to structure a lecture? How do I do it? And then I followed up my create the need with a quote. I want to take you guys from being scared to prepared. And that quote sounds sweet to the ears. It rhymes, it flows nice. And so you're like, okay, I want to go from scared to prepared. And even subconsciously, it takes you to that place of like, yes, I want that. I want to learn that. And so that was how I created the need this morning. Is I wanted to take you guys from being nervous about preparing a lecture to saying, yeah, I can prepare a lecture, totally, no problem. So every lecture needs something to create a need. And there's this great quote that I love. It says, unless a speaker can interest his audience at once, his efforts are in vain. So if people are not interested in what you're saying at the beginning, then it's very unlikely that you will maintain their attention or gain it back. So the next thing you want to do is overview. So you want to overview your lecture. And like I said, this is all on the sheet. So your overview, you are going to tell them what you are going to tell them. You're going to tell them where you're going. You're going to tell them what you're going to talk about so that people understand what you're talking about. And you're going to lay out a map so that people know where you're going to. And then next comes the body of your lecture. And in your body, you will have main points. And your main points should remain somewhere around 2 to 5 main points. Beyond 2 to 5, most people aren't going to maintain or remember them. which is why I give you the booklets as well, because I can't condense this down into less than 10 main points. So you want to be concise and orderly in your main points. Your main points should always be precise and help people to know exactly what your main point is. So for example, my main points, whenever I give you a main point, I tell you this is number 7 or this is number 8, and then I can tell you the main point so that everybody knows what the main point is, what we're talking about. And you can order your main points in many different ways. Look at the booklet to get more information on them, but some examples are topical main points or chronological main points, or you can ask journalistic questions, who, what, when, where, why, for your main points, that kind of stuff. And after your body of the text, you have application. And I'm going to do a short lecture on application on Tuesday, but I'm going to do something briefly here. Now, a lot of you guys probably, maybe not a lot, but some of you guys I know from homework didn't like having to have an application for your revelation point. It was just like a drag sometimes. Thought like, why do I need to have a application for something that like the Lord is teaching me or that I'm learning? But application is the finish line to the race that you're running. If a runner trains for a race and is at the race starting line, running the race with all the rest of the racers, he's in first place, nearing the end of the finish line, and just walks off from the race, it'd be pointless. There'd be no reason that guy even trained for the race if he didn't finish it. And so the point to a lecture is application. The book with the least amount of application in the Bible is the book of Hebrews. There's the least amount of application for weighing the amount of theology in the book. Paul, on average, is 50-50 in his lectures, in his books. Half will be devoted to theology, half will be devoted to application. Jesus, on average, his teachings contain 70% application. That's a lot. Most teachers you listen to are going to teach, and then they're going to have a few points of application here or there, but Jesus is 70% in his teachings, full of application. So when you deliver application, you want to call people to action. That's the goal of application, is to call somebody to action. And you can do this through sharing personal stories or sharing practical applications with them. And don't assume people are just going to pick up on what you're trying to tell them. Tell them blatantly. Say, this is what the application is. This is what you need to do. This is how you need to change. And some statistics on application. So, 80% of the people that are in your audience are going to be adopters. Okay? Now, can I use you as an example for this? Sunny, can I use you as an example for this?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to ask their permission, because we can look at this and say, oh, that's a bad thing. But for us, we want to go from being adopters to innovators. Okay, that's the progression we want to make. Okay, so at the end of my last lecture, what was my application? You guys all did it. Talked and prayed for one another. So my application was that you would pray for one another. I told you to pray for one another, and everybody prayed for each other. And in my application, I said, pick one thing and pray for one another. first thing Sheree asks me is, do I have to just pick one thing? Because she adopted what I said. She didn't innovate with the application and just say, okay, well, I'm going to pray in any of these. So it was saying, okay, exactly what he said, I'm going to do that exactly. And so, for example, with Sunny, when I taught the book of James, I talked about how I made my bed every day. And then the next day she came up to me and said, I made my bed this morning because of what you said yesterday. And so she adopted the application, which is great. It's getting people to do something. But 80% of the people that you teach are going to adopt exactly what you say. They're going to hear it and they're going to do exactly what you say. And they're not going to advance on it at all. You're only going to find 15% that are going to adapt it and that will do something else inclusive of it. And you only find 5% who will innovate and who will do something completely different based off of principle. So the 5% are those who hear the application, think of the principle, and then do something else based on that principle. And so, like I said, I'm not like trying to be offensive in any way for you guys, but this is most of the crowd, right? And this is, so when the important thing to know about this is to know when you do an application, people mostly will do exactly what you tell them to do. They won't do something else. That's, I think, why Jesus was so general in his application. He said, take up your cross. You're like, well, what does that look like? What am I supposed to do? Or be the light of the world. Okay, well, what do you mean be the light of the world? He's really general and leaves it up to us. And so that trains us to be innovators of what that means. But most of your crowd is not going to be like this. And if you don't give them something specific, they often will not do it. All right, so the next thing you want to do is to summarize or review. So review always comes after, at the end. You always want to review. Can you think back to my James and 1 Peter teaching? At the end of the lecture, I reviewed everything we talked about. I had you guys tell me what were the 5 main points of James. And then I had you tell me what were the main points of Peter. And so there's always a review. You want to make sure people heard what you told them. Okay? And after this, you have a closing. And closing is super important because this is what people are going to remember you by. People will remember the last things you say, okay? So your closing is very, very important. Okay. We might go until 12:20. We'll try to finish everything. So the last thing that people hear, your closing, is important because that is often what they will remember. So a great way to think about this structure is in the overview, you are going to tell them what you are going to tell them. In the body, you are going to tell them. And in the review, you're going to tell them what you told them. So, a lecture, tell them what you're going to tell them. It helps everybody remember where you're going. In the body, tell them. And in the review, tell them what you told them so they remember what you told them. All right, number 9. Point number 9. Illustrating your lecture. You want to avoid death by PowerPoint, which is what I'm trying not to do right. So in illustrating your lecture, this is one of the most important things. And we'll talk about this on Tuesday when we talk about learning styles. But most people are visual learners. Okay? So over 65%, I think it's close to 75% in this room, majorly are visual learners. Okay? Actually, I think it's closer to 65% is visual learners. And what that means is that when you have an image to place with something, you will remember it easier. I did that with the book of James. in DBS. We had a skit for 3 of the main points, and then for the one about the tongue, I did the teapot into the water, or poured into the glass, and then for wisdom, or not for wisdom, whatever other one, there was the rock that I had, the big rock versus the sand, right? And so those lectures helped us to understand, or those illustrations helped us to understand the lecture. And illustrations help you to keep it from being dull and boring, okay? So that's why I have a PowerPoint and why I threw some funny pictures in there. So I'm going to walk through like what I'm doing as a teacher so you guys will recognize it and then begin to recognize it in other people, right? So the first picture I threw up was of a praying baby. And I actually Googled funny praying baby because I wanted the first picture to be funny. So I found a funny picture of a praying baby and I put it up there. And then gathering resource material. There was a guy diving into a dumpster. So also a little bit of comic relief, right? And then illustrating your lecture, people falling asleep to a PowerPoint. And it's ironic because I'm doing a PowerPoint. So when you illustrate your lecture, you want to think about your audience, their response to it, how they're going to think about it, and will it connect them? So why do we illustrate a lecture? Why do you guys think we illustrate a lecture? Help visual learners? Yeah. What else?
And we're doing it bilingually, so it means to keep everyone.
Yeah, helps keep everybody together if they're English second language.
They say one picture is worth more than 10,000 words.
Yeah, picture's worth 1,000 words. It's all very true. Having visual aids helps in retaining information because you have something to connect it with. They help to explain a concept. That's why Steve Gregg used the lemonade to explain the Trinity. Because it's a visual concept. His illustration helps you to remember, oh yeah, it's kind of like this. Illustrations help to get your point across, and they also aid in credibility. But does every point need illustrated? Maybe not. So you need to ask the question, does my point need to be illustrated? What is the purpose of the point you're trying to make? Is it to clarify something? Is it to convict or inspire? Or is it to convince? And then what kind of illustration best suits my point? Which is why I brought in skits and also had something physical that people could see. And why I have a PowerPoint here, so you guys aren't just listening to me, but you have something to look at. So there are many ways to illustrate your lectures, not just through physical means, okay? So you can illustrate your lecture through examples. These can be brief, or they can be extended, or they can even be hypothetical. Jesus' parables, all of those are hypothetical stories. None of them are actual stories. He emphasizes a point through a made-up story, or a story that encapsulates an idea, like the parable of the vineyard and the son, right? You can use testimonies, and testimonies are an amazing way, if you have your own, to illustrate points, or through other people's testimonies. All through this morning, I've used tons of stories to illustrate my points, about spending time with your students and getting to know your audience, and how Dan Bauman helped me with that. And all sorts of stories. So you don't have to use your own, but you can use others' stories to illustrate your point. Dan Lewis finished his lecture on Tuesday with somebody else's story to illustrate his point about being part of something that's bigger than yourself. And he used somebody else's story to do that. So you can use stats to emphasize your point or to illustrate it. But you want to use statistics sparingly. Because statistics will bog people down, and most people, it'll get them hung up, and they'll be thinking about the statistic, and it's not a great way to illustrate, but can be effective. So you want to not use it that often, but sparingly. And stories falls in with testimonies as well, but stories are a great way to illustrate your lecture. because they help people to have something to relate it to. There's an Arab proverb that says, "The best speaker is he who turns ears into eyes." The best speaker is him who turns ears into eyes and makes you really see what he is saying. So you visualize it. Jesus is a great teacher like this. So for visual aids, we'll review, you want it to be clear. It helps with retention. Visual aids will give people interest, and it will help to persuade. And as you have visual aids, stuff like pictures or maps, drawings, you want to make sure that it states your point clearly and it can be seen by everybody. Okay? Things you don't want to do are pass your visual aid around. Okay? So the reason is that people will get distracted by it. So if you have a visual aid that you want people to see, invite them up at the break to come and see it. Because if you pass it around, people are going to lose attention because they're looking at something and hold it, and they'll lose their place in your lecture. So if you really have something you want people to see, then invite them up to see it afterwards, or figure out a way to do it where you can take a break as you're showing them the item. All right? When you have it in your hand, you don't want to talk to your visual aid. Okay? So some people will just have something in their hand and they'll look at it and they'll talk to it. And they'll express all their points and continue talking about their lecture, and they'll be looking at it the whole time. But you want to make sure you're maintaining eye contact with your audience. Your visual aid should not be your most point of attention, your biggest point of attention. And it definitely helps with stage fright. So if you're nervous to come up, visual aids will help you a lot. All right, number 10, last point. Point number 10. Writing your lecture. So with everything else we've gotten to, this is the final step where you're going to write everything down. You're going to have the final prepared piece, and you're going to be ready to deliver. And if structure is building the house and putting the frames up, writing your lecture is like decorating the house. Okay? This is where you put everything inside to make it beautiful, how you're going to do it, and what it's going to look like. Okay? So some ways to write your lecture, you can do it word for word, which is how the lecturers in Taiwan have to do it, because they have to have their lecture translated. So because they have it translated, they have to write out word for word, and then the lecture gets translated, and then so the translator can follow along with the lecturer. So I have never written out a lecture word for word, and I think that'd be the hardest thing in the world for me to do, because I'm a verbal processor, and I never know exactly what I'm going to say on a point. But things to do are to write out the important points, to write out your main points, and then to write out sub-things. So what are you going to include for that main point? So if I'm going to say, like, God's character and nature, what am I going to say about it? What are the sub-points for this main point? And like I've been saying all morning, do what works for you, and don't feel like you have to do what everybody else does. And take your time to look at experienced teachers' notes. See what they've done, see how they do it. Look at their notes so you can get ideas for yourself. Like I've said, teachers are the best thieves. Best teachers are the best thieves. You want to be good thieves, to look at what other people have and to use that as well for your own. And as you are writing your lecture and looking over it and reviewing it, use color to highlight it to help emphasize your main points. Even when I do a lecture on the computer, I will review my lecture and I will highlight it in different colors. I have one color for main points, or points I need to be sure to emphasize. I have one point for illustrations, one color for illustrations, and I have another color for all my scripture references. So I remember, okay, these are the ones I need to read out. These are my illustrations, these are my main points. But when I do it by hand, I always just highlight things in yellow. And as you write your lecture and get prepared to present it, review it, reread it, read over it again. before doing this lecture today, I've read both of these, this lecture in my notebook and the one on my computer, probably 5 or 6 times, just to make sure I know what I'm covering, where I'm going, and what I'm doing. So that is the final deal in writing your lecture. Be familiar with your material. Okay? So, we have 10 points in preparing your lecture. What is point number 1? What is the first thing you do? Pray. Very good. What about number 2? Consider your audience. How about number 3? Choose your book or topic. Very good. Number 4? Study and collect resource. Very good. Number 5? Set your goals. Number 6? Mind map and brainstorm. Number 7? Very good. Number 8? Number 9? Illustrating. And number 10? Writing your lecture. All right. Do you guys feel like you could prepare a lecture right now? You feel like you know what you would need to do to do it? Okay. That's good. That's the goal of today, that you would understand how to prepare a lecture. So, if any of the points were confusing for you, or you would like more clarity on them, you can come and talk to me, or you can look in the Basics of Bible Teaching handout booklet, and it's all in there as well. So, you can check that out. Let me pray for us, and then we will go eat some lunch. Lord, I thank you so much for this morning, God, and for your word. And yeah, that we get to teach your word, Jesus, that you have